All right. Well, Ararita 418, thanks for joining me this evening. I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time out of your very busy schedule to discuss magical things with me.
Nope. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. A little bit of history. BJ is a longtime friend of mine. We've been working within the same magical circles for roughly our entire magical careers, although not necessarily at the same time. Our history and shared contacts goes back to the original America Online chat rooms and the occult Ask a Witch. Yes, the old Ask a Witch forums. His early contacts in the magical community were people that I was familiar with, who have seemed to have faded into the background, but might be returning soon. Who knows? It's hard to keep any occultists out of things, for sure.
Yeah, that whole fading out and coming back thing. Who would do that?
Not me. I never went full Fundy Christian. Oh, wait.
and I never went retired recluse.
That was your Dark Night of the Soul, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's worth noting that it's your fault that I'm currently a Thelemite. I like to blame Jason Miller on the interwebs just to kind of rile him up. But he suggested that maybe magical orders might not be all bad. But it was actually you who invited me to the O.T.O. Gnostic Masses. I published my first Gnostic Mass. You were the priest at that. I hope it was not too terrible the way I published that, but it was one of the most hilarious and uncomfortable things. Like I would hate to be the priest in that particular Mass while the deacon's running around looking for things. But I went ahead and included all the excruciating details just to get to the point that when it came down for that spiritual transformative moment, it really didn't matter as much how uncomfortable it might have seemed in the beginning, because at the moment that I stared into the starry skies of the goddess, it was just awesome. And I will be forever grateful for you inviting me and performing that Mass. It was super cool.
I'm glad to have been able to be a part of that. And I think that kind of illustrates the neat thing about the offices of the Mass, is that the office of the deacon is very different from the other two, in that, I remember we had the Mass, I remember you being there, I remember doing the Mass. I don't remember anything about the deacon having to run around and find stuff, because when you're there in the office of the priest or the office of the priestess, everything is just kind of, it's all about what's happening there. And so the whole state of mind is completely different. So, like, you can come out of a Mass where it's like stuff's happening that's a mess, but if you're like jacked into the transubstantiation and to the actual like alchemical circumstances of the Mass, then it still happens and it still all works out. And like the idea of the deacon is they're supposed to be the guy on the ground, being the sorcerer, manipulating the forces, and then dealing with all the things that happen in a temple when you do that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, so you've done a lot of ceremonial magic like the Mass that's by rote and ritual and has speaking parts at certain times. But you've also done, I got to attend the angel magic class where you did a Trithemian rite, and it was really cool to see how, that whole, the way you interpret it versus the way I interpret it, how much we had in common, and just how the little nuanced differences totally, the way you changed it kind of made it entirely a reflection of your own magic. I thought that was really cool to see and bear witness to. But yeah, you've done extremely long and extended rituals. You've got some videos on the YouTubes floating around of some of the longer rites you've done. But you've also done the short and sweet, the simple things. And you've done everything from ceremonial magic to traditional grimoire stuff. And I'm kind of curious. What's your take on the difference between something like a ritual that's designed by Aleister Crowley and under his Golden Dawn and O.T.O. and AA influence versus doing a Solomonic ritual by rote from a more traditional text?
Well, I find and this is actually something that I've been talking about a lot lately. It's kind of the disconnect between lodge magic and other magical systems.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of lodge magic is set up to teach you magic. It's not necessarily set up as a system of magic to go out and practice in a usable, practical sense. And I think it's really interesting looking at some of the stuff that Crowley wrote and some of the stuff with Mathers and the Golden Dawn magicians, because they're like the end of traditional magic for a few decades, where after them you get Fortune and Regardie, and they kind of take the Golden Dawn system and they run with that in this much more new thought type of structure.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you look at magic in theory and practice, it's clearly, while it's got a lot of Crowleyism in it and Crowley putting his spin on everything, he's kind of writing to set up for you to be able to go and do grimoire magic. And some of the stuff that he talks about in other parts of Book 4 is for that as well. And there's clearly elements of the Golden Dawn system that are setting you up to be able to do traditional grimoire magic and traditional alchemy. But I think because they didn't have a wide array of sources to work from, or very complete sources, they built up this structure where they took their teaching system and they were like, well, we can just ritualize the teaching system to fill in the holes, and then there's a nice standard way that people can practice it. And I think a lot of times it's a little more stilted. You might have seen a few years ago, I had put out a Salimic conjuration ritual, which Rob Hager actually, I think, had put up on his blog at one point.
Mm-hmm.
But it took the Solomonic ritual structure, but replaced a lot of the conjurations with things from Salimic holy books and restructured the conjurations to be more Salimic.
Mm-hmm.
We even did a whole drawing out of a circle in salt on the temple floor, and we read from the holy books while we drew it out. But the circle that we drew used much more Salimic symbolism and Salimic god names. And kind of while I was doing it, I had this feeling of, this is really awkward and weird. And and I mean, it worked. The spirit manifested, and we were able to interact with the spirit. But several people that were in attendance said that and all came up to me separately and described this, that their feeling was they could tell the spirit came early on in the conjuration. And I know I've experienced this when working with the longer conjurations, that there's kind of this sense of the spirit shows up and it's like, hey, I'm here, and you keep doing the conjuration, and it kind of continues opening that gateway so that the presence becomes stronger and it's able to get through more easily.
Right, more and more palpable.
Right, and so there was that element of it, but instead of the, all right, hey, I'm here, I'm gathering myself together and getting into the space, it was kind of like, what are you guys doing? And everyone kind of had that response to it. I think the Lodge Master had a more response of, he felt more connected to what was happening because he felt more comfortable with the readings we were using. Nothing to do with the manifestation of the spirit as far as his response. Everyone else basically was like, yeah, the spirit sort of came up, and you get this feeling like it's looking over like, what is going on here? And then at the end of the conjuration, when you switch to traditional god names and it starts sounding more like a traditional conjuration, it was like it snapped to attention and then was like, oh, right, okay, we're doing this.
Yeah.
And so I think to some degree there's that stylistic element of that the traditional magical systems are set up to do a certain thing, and they're set up to do it a certain way. And whereas the modern lodge magic is set up to teach you how to do that, but it's also set up to create mystical changes. Where we talked in Neoplatonism about working clergy and building yourself up to move through the different hypostases and develop the different virtues associated with those hypostases in order to bring yourself to a state closer to the gods so that you can work more miracles the way that the gods would. In modern ceremonial magic, we do lesser banishing rituals and star rubies and star sapphires because they all have initiatic components to them. They all change the interaction of our souls in the world and our physical bodies even in a way where everything's more aligned so that we can work with these systems better.
Right.
I think there's a great deal of value in that. And I think that's why I said to you for years when you were like, no, I'm just going to do the Gemara stuff. And I'm like, but Rufus, you got to learn this other stuff too, is that it builds up a whole way of approaching everything and a whole way of interacting with everything that makes you into a magician. It doesn't necessarily teach you magic. It doesn't necessarily mean you can go out and do magic if you haven't learned it, but it's kind of like going to the gym.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. And having actually gotten sucked into your wily little ways, I can I can now attest that, that's entirely exactly what it is. You sit in a sauna every day for half an hour for a year or two, and you start to pick up on some of the signals that are going on in your head, and that gives you the ability to differentiate between what you're thinking and what the spirit's trying to communicate, for example. And all the rest of it, all the rest of it piles on. But at the same time, I did a goetic rite, and by that I mean from the Lemegeton's Goetia, using the Lemegeton's conjuration formula, sort of abbreviated because, like you said, it shows up early and then it's just like, through a lot of the curses and threats that aren't really necessary. But I did it at the lodge, and at the lodge, we happen to have one of those 9-foot circles that are painted out on canvas, and it was awesome. And I have this old antique vestment holder, like the robe thing that the Catholics use to hold the robes. And I put that out there, and I made sure I came in my little white robe, and I had the heptagonal seal and the hexagonal seal and the disc, and I was just all set for the whole thing to do the entire conjuration. I didn't have the lion skin belt, of course. I just used my deacon's cincture, But I went ahead and did the robing, the donning of the vestments, and I went ahead and dressed up as I do as a priest in the mass, in the Gnostic mass. And the actual result was incredible. But what you were saying about it showing up ahead of time, it was there as soon as I said its name. It was like all the doorways were open, the pathways were open, the way was made clear between us, and the spirit was there. And I did it in front of a small audience, going for the hopefully having someone poop themselves in the process, but didn't quite succeed in that. But in the process, we had plenty of people who've been doing scrying for years around, and they saw it appear, and they saw it like coalesce right where I saw it, and we compared notes afterwards. And like you were talking about, and it was just, it's really fascinating to see how they actually respond to that whole litany, and how like I had done it before, having done all the O.T.O / AA stuff that I've been doing now for the last couple of years, and the experience is 100% different. There's definitely a huge value to be found in that.
I agree. After at this point, I think I started my AA-related work when I was like 18 and started hanging out around the O.T.O at 19. So my entire adult life has been here.
Right.
So far, I guess I see value in it, having not walked away from it during all that time.
It's too bad you don't have the experience of having the really crappy results that people who don't actually go through it, through the exercises at the gym.
I think I'm sort of unusually lucky in that regard because, and I guess this will go to if we bring up the controversial topic later, but growing up in a family where we didn't actively practice magic, but my father taught me things growing up. He bought me my first magic books when I was like 11 years old. Mm-hmm. And So my whole adolescence, like I used to just carry a bag of magic books with me at school to study in my downtime, and summers would just stay up around the clock reading about magic and practicing. I didn't do that thing that people do where they get a book or two and they study it, but they're afraid to try things. I was from day one doing stuff because before I got books, I was already doing stuff. And
So what kind of books were these that your father was getting for you?
I mean, I started out with basically neo-pagan magic books. My first magic book was D.J. Conway's Celtic Magic, which is a horrible, horrible book. But
no shit. All right. So I got to let you know that was my first occult book, too, when I was, like, 15.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. So
that was like, amazing. But yeah, I also think it's shit now, but it was still, it was an awesome introduction. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still like, I still will recommend Scott Cunningham's book to people because I think one thing that gets missed, even with doing the modern ceremonial magic, I know a couple people who started out just in the working with Crowley stuff, working with Golden Dawn stuff, and they didn't do the sort of neo-pagan witchcraft, neo-pagan New Age magic beforehand, and they don't get a lot of the energetics. They don't get a lot of the metaphysical elements and sort of the idea that magic is about engaging the substantive nature of reality, that you're taking an ontological structure and applying that as a tool to make things work in the world. And so when you don't come at it from that perspective of understanding the underlying nature of the way the world works and trying to engage that nature to manipulate it, I think there's a lot that you miss. And so growing up from being fairly young and working with those systems, and then by the time I was 15, that was when I started initially talking with all of the Ask Witch people and Lud and Pegasus and all of them, and kind of starting to get a much more thorough introduction to things along with the books I was studying. Yeah, I never kind of had the opportunity to go through that like shitty phase of, is it okay to curse on the podcast? Now that I've already thrown one out. I didn't go through that phase of like being a kid who like has no idea what I'm doing. It was like I was always working in structures where there was like guidance and where I was engaged and stuff. So, but I think obviously most people don't get that experience. Most people go through that phase of goofing around and not knowing what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I
mean, I obviously had time where I was goofing around not knowing what I was doing, but it was, I think, a little bit different.
Well, I honestly believe that most people who get into things like the Solomonic systems of magic, and I'm using that term loosely because most people buy Crowley's Goetia and conjure some spirit to win the lottery. I think that's like everybody's first experience with the occult or actual conjuration magic, and it never works out, and they don't understand why. You know, what they don't. There's a phrase in Dune that's attributed to the Orange Catholic Bible. You know, what senses do we lack that we cannot see an invisible world all around us? You know, and that's sort of like how I see most of the failures that people have when they first start out trying to conjure for money, for example, or whatever their first conjuration thing is they just don't even have the senses to see the invisible world, you know. And I think that's something that that actually going through the training exercises that have been turned into a magical system in the thing that you were talking about, you know, in the AA and O.T.O. I think that's, anyway, we already said it. That's the value of it. But yeah, the controversial part of what you're bringing up is the idea of, let's just say it, witch blood.
Witch blood.
Witch blood. So do you honestly believe that you were born, now let me, where do we start? We can start with the Arbitel and how it says, you know, anybody who is not born a magician is going to find themselves, they're going to have a bad time. And I'm paraphrasing. But but basically the idea is that some people are born magicians and some people are not. Your approach to it, you use the term witch blood, and I would love for you to explain what you mean by that.
Okay. So for my position, it's not as stark as the Ararita. My view is anyone can learn magic and develop it like any other skill, but witch blood is a rather traditional way of sort of referring to an innate or natural talent for magic. And I think there's another element to it of, if you really look at witchcraft in a traditional sense and the way that the term witch is used in traditional cultures, one of the complaints that a lot of neo-pagan witches and modern witches have about saying that we need to go back to the old sources for describing witchcraft and understanding witchcraft is that witches are kind of these supernatural monsters, and that it's not just a person who's doing folk magic. It's these supernatural, monstrous forces that go around and do magic in the community. And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. But I think it's kind of interesting looking at the idea that we're going to say that we need to throw that out because we want witches to be anyone who steps up and decides they're a witch. And we can look at the sources and say, well, that's not what the word meant. It meant these people who you were either a witch or you weren't. And I think some element of the type of magic that is associated with witchcraft has to do with that idea of an innate magic or innate power.
Mm-hmm.
Before we started, I mentioned how Jake and I had a little bit of a discussion on my Facebook wall the other day about that. And
Right,
it kicked off because he was...
That's Jake Stratton Kent, for people who are wondering which Jake.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
He had mentioned in one of his groups about O.T.O taking its name from the Goeth instead of in other systems where the magician takes their name from the system they do. That here the system takes its name from the sorcerer because the sorcerer has an innate power that makes them a sorcerer, and then because they have that innate power, they do that system. My view on witchcraft is pretty similar to that, that there's an innate nature to the witch, and that deals with a particular type of magic. And so it's not so much that only people born of witch blood can be magicians. Anyone can learn to do magic, but you can sort of look at it one of two ways. That witch blood is just referring to people who are born with an innate talent for magic and an innate calling towards magic, or it's people that are born with a talent for a particular sort of magic, and that will naturally be part of what they perform. And I think part of the issue on it is that in a very modern context, everyone wants everything to be so egalitarian and so equal, and that everyone is the same, but everyone's special at the same time. And this idea that you have people who are born with this innate power or born with this special sort of magical structure undermines that idea. But you do see amongst more traditional practitioners still an acceptance of that idea. Nikolai Frisvold writes about it in his book, Obia, Sorcerer's Ossuary. He also has a few interviews where he talks about this, that basically the difference between a witch and a sorcerer is that a sorcerer has power transferred to them either through initiation by another sorcerer or initiation by a spirit, whereas a witch is born under conditions that transfer power into the witch.
Yeah, we've got the book, but I haven't actually read it yet, but it's on my list of things to do.
Really, really interesting. Like with any of his work, I always kind of walk away from it wondering, is this actually that system, or is this the crooked path version of that system? But there was still so much meat to what he had in there, despite the fact that it's such a short book. But from the witch blood perspective, in my own background, my mother is a fundamentalist Christian, but my mother's also a seventh daughter of a seventh daughter. And a lot of people in her family do magic. And I didn't know that growing up. I didn't grow up around my mother's family. I was an adult before I found out that my maternal great-grandmother was still alive and had a reputation in the family for being a witch. And my mother told me that part of the issue with her family is that because she's a seventh daughter of a seventh daughter, they all expect that she would be more naturally magical and have more power than the rest of them. And she actually had times growing up outside of her family, she grew up in foster care, where she was mistreated by people because they believed that she was a witch. And there have even been times where in talking with my mother, she'll accept that, yes, in our family, whether we practice witchcraft or not, we're witches because of the conditions of her birth.
Mm-hmm.
My sister, who seems to be somewhat accepting of the magic thing but doesn't really do it, when she was having her children, she would discuss with me whether or not they would be born with witch marks and what sort of witch attributes they would sort of show. Because that's the other element of witch blood, is that traditionally in folklore, witch blood and being a witch goes with having a sight and being born with a sight. So the way I grew up, in terms of what you mentioned earlier with people not being able to see the invisible world and not learning a context for developing that, when I would have dreams about the future, I didn't have my parents telling me that I was silly and that wasn't real. We would sit down and talk about it and then plan family things based on what we were seeing in our dreams.
Oh, that's cool.
If I knew things about people from standing near them, my mom told me that I should develop that talent and that I should explore what I could understand from people based on what I could feel from them, instead of telling me it was something that was real. So those elements, the sight that manifested as a child, were things that I was kind of encouraged in. My sister, she wasn't as lucky in that regard. Another element that my mother had growing up, in addition to the sight, she magnetizes watches, and if she's going through emotional turmoil, electronics around her stop working. And
That's your sister or your mother?
Both my sister and my mother.
Oh, okay.
My sister inherited that instead of inheriting the sight, which I've always thought meant that if they've already got that kind of energy thing moving through them, that would be useful for applying magically, but neither of them really have the component. But, I mean, there was a point when I was growing up where laundry stopped being a chore for my sister, because if she went into our laundry room, the washing machine wouldn't run. And we all thought that she was making it up until we went down there and stood in the laundry room, started a load of laundry. She walked in the room, the machine just stopped and wouldn't start again no matter what we did until she was no longer in the laundry room.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So
All right.
my father's family, they were more of the, you had a lot of people who were kind of interested in magic, interested in dreams and in the sight, and kind of engaged in trying things with that, to the point where when I was growing up and talking about witch blood, my father always thought I was just talking about his family. So I kind of grew up with both sides of my family having a belief in that type of thing.
All right. So do you think that there is a genetic component to this this idea of witch blood? Because that's something that I've always kind of disagreed with you on, but I don't know if I actually understood what you were saying. So I disagree with the idea that there's a genetic component, but I don't. But it sounds like you're saying in your first explanation of it that it just means that a person is born with a proclivity to learn a certain type of magic. But then you talk about your stories and how your family all had it, and when you refer to it as actual blood, it seems like there's some kind of a DNA component in it. So is there?
And I've always been hesitant on that. Like, I do think it's definitely familial and lineal. And, I mean, if you look at even the early covens in the early witchcraft movement, they often made you prove that you had ancestors that were witches in order to show that there was witch blood in your family. But
Do you mean like Gardnerian witches?
I think Gardnerian Wicca was probably one of the first ones not to do that, but Horsa requires that. And that was the group that Sybil Leek was in, and the Horsa people allege that the New Forest Coven that Gardner was allegedly initiated into was part of that same Horsa tradition. But, I mean, Gardner describes that he had to demonstrate witches in his family in order to be initiated into his first coven. In my view, I wouldn't say that it's genetic. I don't think that there's actually like a part, if we sequence the genome of witches, that we would see that they're separate species of humans. But I think it's along the lines of what you'll see people talk about in some Eastern systems, where there's energetic elements that move along with the blood. I have a friend who, another one I've known since I was like 15 or so, who she grew up in conjunction with Italian witchcraft. And there, when they talk about, like, they'll use the phrase of the blood to refer to people who were born with witchcraft. And her explanation of it has always been that there's clearly elements of blood that are harder for us to simulate scientifically, that part of blood's ability to sustain life seems to be something metaphysical. And I don't know that I'd necessarily agree with that, but I think from looking at just different forms of blood magic, blood is definitely something that is a carrier and a conduit for occult energy. And so having something that's tied to the blood in a metaphysical sense makes sense in my mind more than something where it's an actual genetic difference. So the way that I've always understood it is you could have someone who engages in very visceral witchcraft and very visceral magic, and that sort of imbues their life with that magical force, and that passes on when they have children, or like in the case of my mother, where they're born under a particular folkloric condition that marks them as a witch, that then passes on through their lineage as well. But I think it's an occult faculty rather than an actual genetic faculty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So
and
I guess
I don't think it makes us better than other people. I don't
well,
think it's a superiority thing.
all right. So I think that we have very similar viewpoints on this. I come from the Christian background of the elect. You know, the people who are elect, and the people who aren't. And there's nothing we can do to choose it. It's no different than the color of your skin or your, socioeconomic status of your birth. It's not a choice that we've made consciously as part of our life. But the people who, in Christianity, I learned that the people who were supposed to be saved, that God was going to save, would respond to the voice of the Holy Spirit, and it was not because they were doing it on their own free will. It was because they were born to do it. And I've always felt that when I read, like in the Arbitel, that those who are born to magic will, of course, be great at it, and people who aren't are going to have a really bad time. I always assumed it was something similar to the theology component of the doctrine of election, right? So to me, that's how I see it. And when you were first talking about your ideas on witch blood and the idea that it's a propensity for the occult, is sort of that's sort of how I see it. I figure if somebody is capable of being an effective magician, then they will exhibit all the symptoms of people who are drawn to the occult. And if you're drawn to the occult, you can pretty much rely on the fact that you'll be able to do it. Because there are some people who hear about the occult and they look at you like you're a complete moron, and then they go back to talking about the latest fashions out of Paris. They just don't care about, grimoires or translating descriptions of spirits or, figuring out how to get more effective changes in your material existence. Using arcane lore, they just don't give a crap, and that's fine. Everybody isn't supposed to be called to this, but I think that's my resting point of the whole witch blood thing. But
Yeah.
it wouldn't be hard for me to say that I have family that have exhibited witch-like symptoms, but none of my family identified as witches, and I mean, I'm saying that, and my dad built a friggin' pyramid in the backyard when I was 14. So it's hard to
Yeah.
it's hard to say that there's no part of my family that's into all this stuff. But I'm just super hesitant to say it's genetic. But where I do differ
Right.
from you is that I do think it makes us better than everybody else, and and I don't
Well,
mean
I
I don't mean that in a qualitative way. It's just in terms of my personal preference. I definitely prefer to hang out with magicians.
I think you know that in my interpretation of Harry Potter, Voldemort is the hero and Harry is the meddling kid.
You mean the guy that fails every year to take over a high school?
Well, okay, yes, there's that. But I do actually think that and this is something I'll often talk with prospective students about, that I think in the past, and this kind of gets into sort of the aeonic concept of Salima, in the past there was an element where magicians and sorcerers had a role of kind of serving the leaders of society and supporting the leaders of society. Then they had a role of hiding and not trying not to get killed. But I think that now it makes more sense that magicians take more of a leadership role in society. And Crowley kind of talks about this at some point. There's mostly in his letters, but also in some of his more political writing, this idea that if you have these people that are able to kind of penetrate through to the truth of things and understand things and have a deeper concept of how the universe is working and how our society is supposed to be working and moving, that the people that we should be recruiting in to learn these things should be the people who are the upper echelons of society. That was a big thing for him with the idea behind the O.T.O. And that those upper echelons of society should be taking these occult principles and these occult ideas and applying them in how society is being led. And so I think that if we take this idea of the aeon of the crowned and conquering child and the aeon of Horus, that's one of the elements of it, is that magicians and occultists shouldn't be taking this position of being fringe weirdos, that they should be, okay, I can step forward and make something of myself and make something of the world and make the world a better place, guide things into where they're supposed to be as a leader, as opposed to, all right, I'm going to buddy up to this leader who can be my patron.
Right. They take an active forming role in society at the highest levels of society rather than, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having blue hair and multiple piercings, but you're not going to get elected to a powerful office with that. And everybody's not called to do that. Nobody has to, if it's not your will to be a politician, by all means, don't be a politician. But it's okay for magicians to do that. I don't see a problem with Thelemites trying to actually, look good and get good jobs and make changes in the world at a societal level. I think that was ultimately the goal. I think
magic is,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think magic is about understanding the context that you're in and understanding the tools for that context and being able to apply whatever tools you need to. And I think that's what the insight that magic provides for us is. I mean, obviously, I take kind of a hardline traditional approach to defining magic in most cases. I'm not one of the people who accept any act of will as an act of magic. But I think that the magical worldview teaches us that even outside of conjuring spirits and burning candles for things, that we should recognize what it is that's going to make us successful in achieving the goals that we want to achieve, and then applying what we need in order to be successful in those goals.
Yeah. I think the biggest barrier for Thelemites in particular when it comes to trying to gain some kind of socio-political power using their occult powers, I mean, most of the people who have that interest are, in my personal and very admittedly small experience, megalomaniac narcissists who have complete bullshit issues. I mean, they've got full-blown psychotic episodes going on that they have been or should be put away for. They need to be taken out of society because they are a threat to themselves and others. That level of mental psychosis is what draws a lot of people to, for instance, maybe run for office, in a political position, and then go out and talk about how they're, the obsessiveness of the AA or whatever. I mean, this actually happens in real life. But on the flip side, the people who are most effective at leadership, like in the O.T.O., we are both friends with one of the ladies at Blake Lodge who is quiet and stays in the background and she's not like a body master or a bishop or anything, but she's effectively maintained, the cohesive structure of the Blake Lodge for many years now. And when you look at all the successful lodges of the O.T.O. across America, it's almost always a very quiet, competent, efficient woman who smiles and nods at all the crap that gets brought up by all the egotistical people in the lodge, and just keeps the paperwork flowing and the checks going into the bank and the rent paid and the lodge space improved and the wine cabinet supplied. There's just these core people who are most efficient at it, but they seem to take background roles. So how do you go about developing that genius of leadership with also a will to power? You know what I mean? Because there's the thing about Liber Oz that says, every man and every woman is a star and everybody has all these rights. But most of the people who try to use magic for political power are insane, and they end up trying to implement a system that they advocate a system that would rob people of their individual rights that they are assured of in Oz, rather than trying to implement a system that would, help other people have the opportunity, have all people get the opportunity to actually discover their true will and find their genius potential and actually pursue it. So how do you go about balancing all that out?
I think part of the issue has to do with the types of people that we reach out to. And I think this is something that anyone who's worked in any sort of O.T.O. Lodge leadership has probably had discussions about before. Our comfort zone is often reaching out to the neo-pagan community and then reaching out to sort of fringe communities and places where we think that we'll be accepted and we think that we'll fit in. And I think you've heard a little bit of my kind of interpretation of the Gen Xer mentality versus the millennial mentality in terms of approaching Salima. That you have one where there's a very countercultural element, and then you have one where there's this generation that grew up in hypermedia culture where everything's about interconnectivity and about sort of ethically diving into whatever without sort of social restriction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if we stay in the countercultural mindset, you can't ever really have a countercultural mindset that's going to be able to take on leadership roles in culture, because it's in opposition to that. And I think that the people that we reach out to through that countercultural mindset are often going to be those people that, well, yeah, we'll get some people who are together and that they're good at running things. They are going to be the people that are more comfortable in the background on it. And we're going to get a lot of people that fit into that kind of marginalized sense of they weren't the cool kids in school. They weren't the ones that were in charge of stuff growing up or in their jobs. And they want to have a space where they can feel away from all of those sort of oppressing forces, and where they can feel like they have some power and they have some say and they can be comfortable being different. Whereas when you move out of that counterculture structure and it's sort of more about just the engagement, then that kind of sense of needing that separate space or needing to get your people who are outsiders kind of falls away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of elements of Salima in particular that speak to millennials very clearly. Like when I was in college, even before I actually joined the O.T.O., when I just hung around the O.T.O. a lot, I used to hand out Oz's all the time and sometimes pull out some of the other Salimic texts and show people. And the response was pretty consistently, yeah, of course, this makes sense. This is obviously how the world is. And
Right.
but a lot of it was also but why would I go join a group like that? And
Right. What's this magic crap?
right. And even like you get people who they think the magic stuff might be interesting or might be neat, that sort of sense of counterculture marginalization makes them uncomfortable. And so they come in and they're like, well, yeah, the ideas and the stuff that you guys do is kind of cool, but I feel sort of awkward here because I'm coming in dressed like a skater kid and everyone's looking at me weird because why would a kid like that come to a place like this? And I mean, I've had that kind of experience a little bit being a prep school kid coming into sort of the magical realm of things. Actually, Pegasus said once when I was a young adult that I was basically the only prepster magician that he knew. And
that's so funny. Have you seen his book cover picture lately?
Right. But I mean, at the time, this is when he was sort of a gothy chaos magician.
Right.
And so, but you kind of have a lot of that where there's this sense of, I mean, we once at a Blake meeting, I was talking about putting up flyers just in like regular parts of town, and a couple officers who are no longer officers now kind of had this very vitriolic response of that we shouldn't cast a wide net because normal people couldn't possibly handle Salima and couldn't possibly understand what we were doing. And
right.
that we should stay with the freaks and the weirdos. And like that was actually how they described it. And
so they're actually afraid that if we start to, if the friggin' word of the eon gets accepted by the masses, then the heat of normalcy is going to melt their special snowflake status.
I think that's pretty much it. It's that they have a place where they have this comfortable bubble of being able to be special by being different. And I think they're afraid that that'll get eroded if it opens up to everyone else. Whereas I think that a lot of what society is trending toward, we're kind of in that precipice point where it could very easily go in a direction that's much more open to the ideals of Salima if we were able to communicate them in an open way that was kind of open to everyone. Or if there's not a force entering in like that, that it would be very easy for society to go into another direction, kind of Donald Trump.
Well, honestly, not to turn this in any way into a plug for any particular organization over any other particular organization. I've noticed that the Living Thelema podcast is one of the most approachable ways to kind of integrate some common sense Thelemic practices into your daily life. And I think one of the best things about David Shoemaker's approach to his presentation of all this esoteric lore is that he doesn't pretend like it's something that is hard or different or weird. He makes it sound very calm and soothing and correct and easy, and something that everybody can do if you just apply yourself to it a little bit. And when you look at it this way, you can totally see the blah blah. And it's like you don't even realize what he's doing is making it normal. He normalizes it. He doesn't turn it into, today in Salima, what we're going to do is some radical shit. It's just it's a PhD psychiatrist talking about some very simple methods of changing yourself and your reality, and it's
right.
But he's not the only one. There's the 0 = 2 podcast has kind of shifted gears, and they're like, here's the wines that pair with all these different things that incorporate occult symbolism, and here's Crowley's recipes of food that he actually liked. You can cook it yourself, and it appeals to the millennial foodie kind of crowd. I think that there is. I think what you're talking about is you're touching on a sea change, a paradigm shift, if we want to use the 90s vocabulary on it. From that individualization to actually, wait a minute, guys, we have a lot of people doing this right now, and we can just be normal, and it's okay. The society is open to gay marriage now, and transgender issues are if there is a state like North Carolina that goes opposite what most people of the younger generation want, then the younger generation is like, screw you, we're not going to do that anymore. And I think that what I've seen in the last few years in Thelema is that what you're talking about is sort of the direction that a lot of people are starting to move towards across the country. And it actually gives me a lot of hope, you know. This normalization of Thelema is something that I think it's inevitable. And I think that most of the people who are opposed to it are closer to the boomer generation, you know. And they're the extreme radicals from the 60s and 70s who had to carve out some kind of niche. And, you know, that's okay. They needed to be that at the time. And maybe that's how the flame got carried forward and the coals made it to the tender of the Generation X, hopefully Generation X. Maybe those snake people, millennials, I don't know. But
I don't mind being a snake person.
but see, the problem that I see for the millennials is that they lead in teams. You know, they don't lead in individuals. And I think that was kind of the power of the countercultural movement. But it was just everybody was an individual in the counterculture AA and O.T.O. Everybody was an Ipsisinus, and everybody was the inheritor of Aleister Crowley and the new incarnation of Aleister Crowley. And you know, I'm going to write the fourth book of Thelema, or of Liber Al, you know, and that goes all the way back to Parsons. It's not new that we're all egotistical bastards, but I don't see a lot of. I guess I'm trying to say, is there enough ego left in millennials to rise up and take leadership positions in a way that facilitates Thelema, that ensures, you know, liberty for all?
Well, I think one thing that people miss about Salima a lot is that ego and the idea of stark individualization is really a very second aeon thing. That's kind of what the nature of the Eat is, and what the nature of the dying and rising God is. And the third aeon is kind of the combination of Nuit and Hadith. And Nuit is all communitarianism, and that everything is about the community and the greater whole. So the age of Horus has to be one where you can kind of balance this like impressive individuality with a strong sense of community involvement, and where the power of the individual is constantly being channeled back into the community, and the community is constantly feeding into the power of the individual, but that each individual is able to be a star working within that structure, as opposed to anyone eclipsing the rest of them.
Yeah.
And I think if, in terms of like that question of do millennials have that kind of ego concept, Neil Patrick Harris is basically the god of millennials, even though he's probably an Xer. But the sort of the image that's been created around him with his role as Barney Stinson on How I Met Your Mother is kind of the millennial dude bro icon. And it's all about like being this legendary epic individual that's able to draw people in with the amazingness of your adventuring. But you do all your adventuring to be epic and amazing and be this like legendary awesome figure with all your bros.
Right.
And so it's like you're kind of all feeding into each other and feeding into the ability for all of you to be awesome.
Right. And even though you're
so,
fulfilling all the societal expectations of the most macho manly man, you're also secretly gay.
Right. And like, and that's the whole thing with I mean the dude bro culture is also the man crush culture.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, exactly. The bromance.
Like yeah, there's definitely and I think, I mean, I'm definitely at the older end of the millennials, and so some of that fluidity and that flexibility, it's kind of there, but people aren't necessarily as comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the younger end of millennials, it's incredibly fluid, and you
right.
have this whole thing where everything is sort of a mix of different things and moving back and forth, not just in terms of sexuality or in terms of gender identity, but all kinds of different structural things. No one wants to accept that everything has to be this one structure at all times, but it's
Right.
not that same counterculture sense of tearing down all the structures. It's that you can kind of manifest what structure you need to for whatever's going on, and I think that's actually incredibly magical.
Oh
And
yeah.
like this whole idea of just fluidity in general is one that is a very traditional magical concept. I actually had kind of an interesting moment about 2 years ago. I was giving a lecture at a college about the idea of sexuality and freedom, and how kind of this sort of American concept of liberty and sort of sexual engagement through a structure of liberty is a way of understanding the divine, as opposed to something that keeps you from the divine. And one of the things that I talked about towards the end was about homosexuality and sexual fluidity. And so I'm talking to a bunch of college students, and I get to this point where I start talking about the power of homosexuality, and that we talk about homophobia and how you have all these people who are kind of afraid of gayness and afraid of people being infiltrated by homosexuality and turned by this power of the homosexuals. And they kind of try to undermine it, and society has always tried to undermine it with this sort of Nancy boy image of the idea of the gay man as this effeminate fairy type who is this weakling that isn't quite a real man. And no one's going to be afraid of that. Like, clearly, if that were the reality, no one would be afraid of homosexuality. People would just laugh it off. Homosexuality is terrifying to people because it's transgressive, and transgression creates power. And if you want to look at that sort of transgressive power in a more classical magical sense, that's where you get that sort of mercurial, hermaphroditic fluidity going on, where you have something that it's not heterosexual and it's not homosexual, but it's not really bisexual. It just sort of moves between things as it needs
Right.
to.
The gender
And
fluidity. But wait a minute, what do you
right,
mean by transgressional? What's transgressional about gender fluidity? What's being transgressed?
basically the kind of social norm of a binary structure.
Oh,
And
okay.
I don't, when I say transgressional or transgressive, I don't mean it in a negative sense.
Uh-huh.
It's something that comes up in, I don't even know really what academic structure tends to use it. It's mostly people who come out of philosophy backgrounds that I picked this up on, where they kind of talk about the power of transgression, that you're able to, by putting something up against what the expectation is and breaking down an expectation or breaking down a societal barrier, then you're taking power over what that barrier and that structure is. And then you're kind of able to use that structure and use that barrier as you choose to, as opposed to being controlled by it. And
Right.
that's where kind of social power, transgressive, comes from.
So
And
it's sort of the EIO formula in a way.
right, where you kind of seek out and understand what the thing is, destroy it, and then recreate it into a more perfect form.
Right. The two opposites stop being opposed and become ends of a spectrum, and there's a middle thing that moves up and down the spectrum fluidly, right?
Right.
So, all right, so that's like one of the big mysteries that Crowley's always trying to push on people is overcome this idea of opposites, and Liber, whatever it is, Liber B, Vel Magi,
Yeah.
where you quoted it today in your blog post. The when you truly understand the opposites, you understand that sorrow is joy, and change is stability, and whatever the other one was, and it's basically, he's just saying, once you get to a moment of transcendence, you see that the opposite poles of a spectrum, heterosexuality, homosexuality, or, male, female, or gender identity, or whatever these opposed things are, they're actually, two ends of the same thing, and you just move between them all the time. and that's the state of the magus. And when you try to take that concept as some kind of mind-blowing spiritual enlightenment and an illuminative state, some kind of samadhi thing that happens to you once you've done all this magical practice moving up through 9 friggin' spheres, and finally, you get to the Hokmah, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my God, gender is just how I feel in the moment, and existence is pure joy, and you try to take that to a millennial who's basically, sometimes I'm a sapiosexual, it's just, it kind of seems ridiculous. And
Yeah, and I think
I'm like, I honestly, I kind of get where you're coming from with the millennials. Kind of already get it. I
mhm.
think that they've already integrated the word of the eon, and they're just waiting for the boomers and the Gen Xers to die, because that'll
I
take
mean,
care
I
of
wouldn't
most of
say
the.
that, but when I hang out with my younger magician friends, we all sit around and talk about it.
I wouldn't say that publicly, but no,
Well,
I've
I guess
kind
I just did.
of. Yeah, I, I can edit that out, but I won't. I think
No,
people
no.
need to hear about it. No, I mean, seriously, though, I think that that's kind of a very interesting facet to the whole millennial approach to occultism. This whole grimoire movement and the explosive interest in these ancient texts. It's like Jake Stratton Kent started this whole sea change with his Geosophia and all of his interesting books. And when you read them, not one of them has a set of practices at the end of each chapter. 10 steps to integrate the information of this chapter. It's I read Geosophia and I'm like, I finished one chapter on the Sibyls and the next chapter dove into something completely different. And I'm like, there's no thread of this. This is just, here's a bunch of information that's really interesting about how people used to do magic and what magic meant to them and how it wasn't like it is now. And then the next chapters, here's some completely different information about magic and how it used to be and how it's not anything like it is now. And it wasn't making a point, but the whole thing was a complete argument that made a really amazing point that magic is just how you live, and it's something that should be integrated in your social structure and your respect for your dead. You should understand that this whole idea of celestial versus terrestrial is ridiculous. These two apparent ends of a spectrum are actually the same thing, and used to be that all the planets were underground and you'd go into a Mithraic cave to experience the celestial powers because it wasn't celestial, it was, chthonic, it was the underworld. And it's just this whole integrating this I guess the word of the eon, the that it's do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I just see it happening everywhere, and I really think, honestly, that the O.T.O and the AA are catching up to it. you know, I honestly think that we're just trying to catch up to the rest of culture, and we have all of the structures and the organization framework that could provide a way and means for people to have a greater experience of it if they're interested in that kind of thing. Um,
Right.
but I do.
I,
Go ahead.
I think that what you were saying earlier in terms of kind of agreeing about millennials already being there on a lot of these ideas that, and sort of like say something where it's like, oh, this mind-blowing thing, and they're like, I think that's one of the things that's great about the structure is that there's kind of the element of people kind of get it, but then there's this element of, yeah, but when you deal with it within the rest of this whole context and where you are unfolding back into the origin and kind of unmaking yourself back to what everything comes from, that the perspective you have on this thing has a very different nature to it than kind of what that natural perspective is. And so I think that is the value of making sure that we still have things like the O.T.O. and the AA in
Mm-hmm.
place, even if that stuff becomes more natural. I think
Right.
it just needs to kind of adapt and develop itself into something that it's dealing with meaningful elements for the people that it's there for now. Because obviously, the thing that people bring up all the time is stuff that was taboo when Crowley was writing isn't necessarily taboo now. So we're
Right.
not confronting people with something by presenting them with the same things that would have scandalized someone who was victorious. And I think sometimes we do a very good job of that, of staying up to date. And then there's other things where we might have a little bit of lag, but I think just about any structure like that is going to have some lag, and needs to just make sure it's bringing in that fresh new blood and making it open for that fresh new blood to be able to communicate things in and
Right.
kind of help update stuff as we go.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the actual strong suits of the O.T.O. and the AA systems are that what they teach are tools and techniques, and they don't teach interpretation. You go through the various initiations of the Man of Earth triad, for example. You don't um, you don't get told what to think. You get given sets of information along the way, and you interpret it on your own. And you're told to go off and think about it, And in all of these things, it's even in the AA structure, which is very rigorous and extremely structured, and you must do this, and you must do this, and you must do it for this long, and blah, 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 blah. And you can read all this stuff in the oaths. I'm not sharing anything that's secret. But it's still a matter of passing on science and technique, and it doesn't tell you what to experience. And the role of your superior is not to judge whether or not you're right or wrong, but whether or not you're getting the kind of experiences that the techniques are supposed to generate. Because the techniques aren't less valuable or less useful, even though they were designed by a Victorian trust fund baby.
Yeah.
They aren't any less applicable today than they were then. I think that's kind of interesting. But I'm not a millennial, so I'm a proud Gen Xer. I look down on the millennials with a significant amount of well-deserved contempt. But
Well, I mean,
in my
we
humble
are
opinion.
so legendarily epic that I can understand the turnout.
Well, I guess. But yeah, I still don't understand why millennials think that whatever. You guys can put together a team and maybe you'll come up with a way to explain that to me. But in the meantime, it's been over an hour now, and our audience is probably mostly dropped off when we start publishing this stuff. So I think we should go ahead and call it.
Okay.
We have plenty of more things to talk about on other discussions. I really enjoyed this tonight. I would love to delve into your work with your translations of the descriptions of the various spirits and the grimoires you're working from, and your your approach to the hot mess that is the Heptameron.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the main crux of what we were going to talk about. We didn't talk about any of that at all.
We didn't get there yet, but we will pick up next time there. All right, but thanks a lot. Don't hang up. I'm going to go ahead and end the recorded session here in just a moment. But yeah, thanks again. And do you have your website that you'd like to give out to people?
Yes. Actually, I am in the process of relaunching my website, which is www.ararita418.com. So there's material up there now. There will be more material over the next month or two. But yeah, feel free to check it out.
All right, thanks again for having this talk with me, and we will carry on next time.
All right, thank you.